Welcome to the Kitcar History File series, where we'll be going through the industry's past. We'll be visiting old marks of long ago, some modern ones, some mostly older stuff. A lot of archive information with photographs and information on the cars they made, the people involved, and what happened to them. Hello, welcome to episode 3 of the Total Kitcar History Files series. My name's Steve Hull, editor of TKC Mag and totalkitcar.com, and this time we look at one of my personal favourites, certainly in my top 10 of kit cars of all time, and I think it probably would be in many people listening to this. GTM Coupe doesn't really need any introduction. Mini base 2-seater, little Grand Tourer, one of the most respected mini base kit cars of all time, and there's been lots of highly respected ones. Made famous really by GTM Cars, who had the project for 15 years, achieved the bulk of the sales, and in fact the car was so good they named the company after it. But we need to go much further back than that. Let's start at the beginning, which is quite a natural thing to do. Right back at the start and how it came about. The project was actually originally called the COX Grand Touring Mini, and it was the brainchild of a Cheshire Renault dealer, a chap called Bernard Cox, who ran a dealership and a company called COX & Co, Manchester, in brackets. Let's not forget the brackets. And I think they were actually based in the suburb of Hazel Grove. As well as the dealership, they had a petrol station right across the road, and Cox's family had several business interests, including, and I don't know of it, but there was a department store, a famous one, posh one, in Wilmslow called Finnegan's, and his family owned that as well. Bernard had raced Elva Couriers back in the late 50s, early 60s, so he was a motorsport man. He liked exciting cars. One of the chaps he raced against in those days was a man called Jack Hosker, Hosker, and he just happened to work for Bernard at Cox & Co as the sales manager. He was also a bit of a handy designer by all accounts, and it was he who was tasked by Bernard to turn his design into the third dimension. So he gave him a pretty exact brief. One of the important points being that he couldn't cut any corners. There shouldn't be any compromises. But Bernard didn't want to get involved in laminating his own fiberglass and bashing metal about, because, as he said, or was quoted as saying, he sold cars, didn't make them. Until that point, it wasn't in 1967 anyway. So that was the brief that Jack had, and I think he came up with a pretty impressive effort. Everybody liked the car. It was low, it was sporty. Another bullet point on the brief was that it had to handle a Mini, and it had to be mid-engined. And as well as being a road car, Bernard was very, very clear that it had to be able to be used on track too. It wasn't a racing car, wasn't intended as that, but had to be, if somebody chose to use it in motorsport, it had to be, as he is quoted as saying, able to be in contention rather than make up the numbers or be a back marker. He wasn't interested in that. So Jack locked himself away in the service bay of Bernard's petrol station over the road, and set himself up. I think it took him about 6 months to get the prototype built. I'm not sure if this is true, but apparently the chassis model was made from cornflake packets in scale form before he sized it up. It does hold, this one might be a bit controversial, but it does hold the accolade of being the first mid-engine kit car. Now, I hear, Steve-O, surely you're mistaken. Surely it was the Lotus Europa. Well, that is strictly true, actually. The Lotus predated it by about 6 months in 1966, but we mustn't forget the original intention for the Europa was that it was the car for Europe. Wasn't available in kit form for the 3 years it was only sold in Europe, not in the UK. And it was when it was launched in the UK, it became available in kit. Now I know kit and Lotus owners don't always like that word, but it still required a good weekend's work with a toolkit to get the thing working. What a great car the Europa was as well, by the way. We'll talk about that in a later episode, I think, definitely. Lotus could well feature in this series quite heavily. Anyway, I digress. So it was good stuff. So I think the problems they had, there were some initial problems that Cox and Hosker had, because Bernard was adamant he didn't want to make his own fiberglass and weld up his own chassis. They relied on outside companies. Usually that's a good thing because quality can be controlled a lot easier and is less expensive, I suppose. But of course, back in those days, and the fact they weren't used to engineering practices, I'm not sure they used the right company. So quality was said to be iffy at times on those early cars. And then there was a massive howler made when the windscreen was measured up and sighted in the body mould. Someone, believed probably to be Hosker, measured it up incorrectly. So the windscreens were too big for the aperture. So what happened was, again on the early cars before the mould was modified, every time those cars hit bumps and stuff and potholes in the road, they would crack, and that caused a lot of tears at bedtime. Of course, Bernard blamed Tudor Glass down on the Isle of Sheppey in Queenborough, which incidentally, I'd like to inject little facts in, was later owned by Pilkington, and it was their specialist division, and they were the people that made. Well, that's where the majority of kitcar glass was produced over a 30-year period, and run by a brilliant bloke called Peter Swan, a more knowledgeable and helpful chap you couldn't wish to meet. He helped a lot of kitcar owners out over the years, did Peter. I think he's retired now, and indeed the site's closed. Hope he's well. So anyway, their intention was they basically got to the point where they could display the show. They aimed to launch it at the Racing Car Show of 1967, January, and they made that date. Their little car with a steel box section chassis. It had modified mini front subframes, two, one in front, one in rear one being locked out so it couldn't give you rear steer, and a GRP body. It all amounted to a launch price of £330 for the whole kit package. And that was, according to the Money Sorter website, is worth around £3,850 today, allowing for inflation. So actually it wasn't a bad price, and it was, if not a bargain, it was pretty competitive, I would say. They took some orders there. They did very well. And that they were busy straight away. They had to work out how they were going to actually build the cars that they got orders for, but they managed to do that. And they supplied the customer with a nice package, by all counts. The kit was supplied with, the body was pre-fitted, doors were pre-hung. But it said, and I don't know for sure, but I've spoken to a few people and read some reports that the kit was not for a rookie. It required someone pretty handy with a toolkit to get that done. There wasn't a build manual, and there was no chassis jig, so I think you had to be a little bit careful when it came to fitting to getting things all geometry and suspension and such like done. And the early cars, the GRP was said to be a poor standard, but they soon ironed all that out and got things moving quite nicely. The press loved it. It got some really good reports for fine handling abilities and general performance. After a little while, a couple of years, it's said that Bernard lost interest in it. He was more interested in selling new cars, by all accounts, and he lost interest in his little baby. He'd done what he'd set out to achieve. Let's face it. He had his own little dream car, and he'd sold a few. I think he'd sold around 50 by the time. I'm not sure if Cox and Co actually went bust, but certainly they weren't selling the GTM anymore. Excuse me. After February 1969. At this stage, one of Bernard's friends, a Mr. Heary, he was a fellow car dealer. He ran a Ford dealership called Midland Garage on Buxton Road in Hazel Grove, just round the corner from Bernard. Now, his son, he's quite Howard, who is still with us and now lives in Australia and enjoying his retirement. He had been in and around the Cox & Co business. He was a pretty useful Formula 3 driver by all accounts, was Howard. In fact, I've seen some photos of him in action in that formula. So he also did some work for Bernard. He did some basic sort of menial work, and also he did a bit of competition driving for Cox. And he ended up taking over the project. I'm not sure. I'm pretty certain he was funded or helped with funding by his father. And he took it over. From about March, April, there was a little gap while he got himself sorted out, but he soon was back up and running. He made an initial change to the kit because he felt that the chassis needed a little bit of stiffening, so he added a supporting frame for the engine, and the kit price had risen to $350. He, over the next few months, he made some more fundamental changes to it. I mean, he added a mini bumper at the front. He resighted the indicators, and he renamed the COX GTM to the GTM 1.3. And incidentally, he traded as Howard Heary Engineering Limited. Some of his adverts were fantastic. There was one that I think it might have been in Hot Car or Triple C, and the strapline was thus. It was very well written by someone that obviously knew a little bit about marketing. And I quote: "Mid-engined like a Lamborghini, good-looking like a Ferrari, beautifully engineered from only the best materials, roomy, fast, economic, and in fact a proper, in italics, GT car." So Howard was going for it. He got a nice little bit of publicity from Cars and Car Conversions magazine, who built one to Group 6 race specification in 1970. And that, again, Triple C was pretty big potatoes in those days, sold a lot of copies and was quite influential to the modifying kit and motorsport scene. So that did him no harm at all. 1981, Howard came up with a more fundamental restyle. He incorporated the mini front bumper into the car, into the mould. And I think a lot of these changes and revisions were done by a quite famous engineer designer in the automotive scene, primarily at Standard Triumph, and his name was Alex Dick. And he'd had some serious input in the past on the TR3. And he gave Howard some much help and did a little bit of re-engineering, I suppose. He lowered it. He made it slightly wider at the front end by revising the nose area, bringing in a new grille. And he, as I earlier mentioned, he blended in the mini bumper into the mould. And he went back to his beloved Triumph, and he used he incorporated Dolomite rear light lenses. And he also got rid of the mini rear or the mini front subframe at the rear, replaced it by a fabricated sheet metal structure, which did the job of holding the engine and such like and reinforcing it. Howard actually had big plans and had the real right idea. He wanted really to move the car away from kits and just wanted to offer fully built cars because, well, clearly the car was capable and it was a very, very good little car, as we all know. He maybe had overstretched himself a little bit. He planned, in fact, he'd identified a 20,000 square foot factory, brand new factory. But he had some finance that was promised, but it didn't arrive, and the inevitable happened. He ceased trading around about March 1972, sadly, and that's a real shame because he was doing he did a sterling job for the GTM. By the time he was done, he'd probably added 70 to Cox's 55, so sales weren't too bad. Then we have a sketchy period in the car's history from 72 till about 1980. Taking over from Howard was one of his glass fibre suppliers, a company called HE Glass Fibre. For some reason they hyphenated glass fibre and they spelt fibre Fiber, which always struck me as slightly odd. But they were based in Hartlepool. But by all accounts, they held the car. They had the project for 4 years and did not a thing with it. There are reports, and Howard mentioned to me that he thought that they didn't know how to build a car, which is why they didn't build one. Then passed to a company called KMB Autosports in Wellingborough, in Northamptonshire. They of course they in turn had another 4 year period with the car, acquiring it from HE when they got rid of it. Man behind it there was called Mike Smith, and he was Autosports. They were basically KMB Autosports. They were supplying motorsport parts and go faster bits and bobs, and did it. And even though I don't believe they produced a kit or made a car available, they did at least have a go at supplying owners with spare parts and such like. And indeed, this is where we come to the most important period of the car's history. The late Peter Beck is reported, or he told me actually, he visited KMB one day, trying in vain to buy some spares for his own coupe that he owned. I think it was in vain actually. He couldn't get what he needed, but he was sufficiently impressed by the car that he'd acquired that he ended up buying the project with his friends Paddy Fitch and Douglas Cowper, although the latter should always be recorded in dispatches, but didn't hang around for long. And they named their company, Paddy and Peter, they named it GTM Cars. Over the next 15 years, they were a fantastic company anyway. I mean, they produced beautifully engineered cars. Everything was first class. The packages they offered were brilliant. Gave people reasons to buy. Gave people great backup and support. And they probably, bit of a guesstimate, they could have sold 600 of those little cars. And they got rid of it in 1995, mainly because they just got involved with the GTM Rossa that Richard Oakes had designed for them. And Paddy told me one day they physically couldn't service two models in the way that they wished to. So something had to give. And a lovely man, he's now no longer with us either, Peter Leslie came along. Primo Designs, his company was called. But just before we leave GTM Cars, they did a lot of revisions to that car and brought it bang up to date for its time. They added a bigger front spoiler. They widened the rear arches to give it a more beefier, aggressive stance. They incorporated into the rear end a GRP bumper rather than a separate item that it had before. And they also changed the light lenses, although they remain unidentified from my point of view. I don't know what they were. They also added a sunroof, Leyland door handles, and they changed the interior, updated the interior nicely, and did a great job. Peter Leslie, people were saying at the time that the car had probably run out of puff and it had probably seen its best days, which undoubtedly it probably had. But it was still, come the mid-90s, it was still a viable proposition. Let's not forget, 1998 was when SVA, now IVA of course, it had been mooted for a couple of years, and a lot of people panicked about cars being able to achieve compliancy for SVA, which was seen as a big bad ogre for the industry. But actually wasn't, and most people got the cars they wanted to be kits to be compliant with SVA, which was no problem. It was always thought that due to its height and the headlight positioning, the GTM Coupe couldn't be made compliant, but it was. Peter actually proved everybody wrong. He made several changes in the name of compliance for SVA, including he moved the headlights back and slightly resighted them. He moved them back by 3 inches. Sold a few kits, did all that work, bringing it up to date and making it SVA compliant, I should say, excuse me. But I don't think he sold many kits. He might have got involved with selling some parts, but sadly Peter became ill and died early into the new millennium. Very shame. He was such a lovely man, Peter. Always nice to spend time with him, and a very kind soul. Loved talking to him. And he always didn't know how really how to take a compliment, because I used to, and me and other colleagues used to say, you've done all the hard work. It's a great car. The package is all there. People will still want it. Certainly now it's SVA compliant. Get it marketed, do a few shows, but he's always unsure. But we did our best, because he did a great job. It lay dormant for a while with Peter's family after his passing. For about 14 years, maybe 15 years. And then Derek Hambly enters the scene. Now, Derek was one of the very first. He was on the grid, the first grid of Dave Bradley's 750 Motor Club Kit Car Challenge series, sponsored by a magazine that I used to work for, Kit Cars and Specials. And there's pictures of Derek on the grid and in action on that first season, and he raced his GTM, a nice little car, a fiendishly quick little car. And so therefore he's always had an affinity with the marque. And so he came along in 2015, bought the car. Now, people made the mistake of saying he'd bought the COX GTM, the GTM Coupe. He hadn't. What he'd actually bought was the Primo Coupe. Now, the Primo Coupe was the revised car by Peter Leslie. Still looks like a GTM, for all intents and purposes, is a GTM. But he's keen and still keen to point out that his car is actually the Hambly Coupe. It isn't a continuation of the COX stroke GTM car. It's a continuation of Peter Leslie's Primo Coupe. Now, Derek's been a fixture at Stoneleigh over the years since he acquired the project. Always nice to see him and talk to him. Does a nice little job. He's made parts available for owners. He can supply you a brand new floor pan or a chassis. He can supply you any body panel part you wish. He's made a little racer, so I've done a car. The yellow car's got beefier arches and spoilers on it. And he's one of the most notable things, because the A series engine is getting slightly sought after and quite scarce. And if you want to tune one, he's, let's face it, quite expensive, to say the least. Peter's looked at, and in fact he's installed it in one of his cars and other cars, the Ford Zetec Sigma SE engine, which works beautifully in the back of a GTM, Hambly. And he's also incorporated the ID5 gearbox to go along with that. And there's another option, if somebody wants a little bit more power, the Fiesta ST150 is an ideal choice. Same engine, basically, same block, and that goes in nicely. So that's where we are today. Probably sales of about, standing on tiptoes, taking a big deep breath, puffing our cheeks out, maybe 730 of them sold over the years. As I said earlier, the bulk of them were Paddy and Peter's. Incidentally, Peter passed away in the late 90s. He died very suddenly, which was a big shock, and that's a great shame. GTM, of course, went their own way as well. Let's just round up what happened with GTM. After Peter's death, Paddy carried on for several years. But as he told me, it was never the same. But by that time, when Peter died, they ceased production of the Rossa and brought on board the, again, a Richard Oakes car, the GTM Libra, fantastic car, and its convertible counterpart, the Spider. We, of course, owned one. Lovely car. They developed, but it still had that essence of the GTM Coupe in all those cars. Rossas, the various Rossas and the Libra and Spider had the essence of that original Bernard Cox, Jack Hosker little GTM. It still wore the badge, shall we say, with pride. And by that time, by the time that the Libra came out in the late 90s, the GTM were right up there in terms of quality of what they were offering. I remember being at a petrol station in ours once and someone saying, "What the hell's that?" And I explained it to him. He said, "It looks like a cut price Noble," which I thought was quite funny. A cut price Noble and a half size Noble M12, which made me laugh. Someone else said the same thing pretty much, but said it was a scaled down Ultima at a quarter of the cost, which is quite funny as well. But regardless, Libra was good. Paddy had, as I said, he'd always said that it was not quite the same without Peter, and he sold the project to Dave Keane. And David did a lot with the project. He developed a few more models. David's a serious businessman with various automotive related companies. Nice chap, very nice chap. Continued to promote the business very nicely. Originally, he took over at Paddy's Sutton Bonington, well-known Sutton Bonington premises in Leicestershire near Barwell. Not Barwell, forgive me, Kegworth. But then took it back to their base in Coventry, where it was then where they were building them and supplying kits from. Sadly, that ran out of puff really. Westfield, the old Westfield, under Potenza Group, purchased the Libra projects with the intention, I think, of converting them to electric power. Went down the road quite a long way with that, but nothing really materialised. And sadly, the GTM is no more. The new Westfield Chesil operation had the moulds, but don't plan on doing anything with them. So it's a real shame because I still felt the Libra had a lot to offer. But anyway, back to the GTM Coupe. I hope you enjoyed this edition. I hope it's brought back some fond memories of that little car. And look out for Derek Hambly at kitcar shows, because he'd love to talk to you, and you can find out more. And he'll still sell you one, which is great news. A car with a real legacy in our industry. It's one of the greats in my view. Just before I go, if you haven't already subscribed, if you've managed to listen this far to my ums and ahhings, I do apologise about that, but I'm not a voiceover artist and I don't profess to be. I'm doing my best. Then please, if you haven't already done so, if you could click the subscribe button, doesn't cost you a penny, hit the notifications drop down thing as well, and choose all, because that means that you'll be notified when a new video drops. And just for the record, so you know, once a month our video editor Neil Winnington releases his monthly feature videos. That's usually around the first of each month, around about then. And then what we're doing with these, and we've done a couple already, which I hope you've enjoyed and heard. If you haven't, just visit the channel. You'll see them on our on the playlist there. If you could subscribe, that would be fantastic. These are going to be a regular thing, these audio videos, every week, every couple of weeks, because we've got a massive archive and we're intending on using it, certainly in pictorial and audio form. And I don't know much about these things, but if you could also hit that thumbs up button, I'm told that really helps. I don't know how it helps, but it really does help the channel. So thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing if you've done that. And look forward to welcoming you to part 4, episode 4, because we'll trawl the archives and do another history, a car from the kit car industry's past, which we hope to entertain you with. Oh, and if you could also, I'm talking about video editor, sorry about this, I'm just remembering stuff as I'm going along, because I had some notes written down, but I've managed to lose them. Our video editor Neil Winnington has got his own channel. If you wouldn't mind, if you'd head over to Nwins Motors, which is ENWIN' Motors, search that on YouTube, and do the subscribe thing, hit the thumbs up button thing, and then we'll all be very happy and we'll be very grateful. So thank you for that, and look forward to speaking to you next time. Bye-bye.